right, here we go. We are nothing if not punctual, right? Most of the time. All right, welcome everyone. I just have to say, y'all are troopers because 2 days is a long time to be in sessions, and especially when it's raining, because then you don't have that just lovely walk through Main Street with the sun shining on your face that we promised before you came. I'm really sorry about that, but someone did remind me, I think Sarah with Rural Partners, I think that was her, that we really need the rain, so we'll be grateful for it. Okay, so I want to hear a couple of things that you learned in your sessions today. I'll give you an example. In the policy session, we learned that fastdemocracy.com is a great way to track bills in any state, which is pretty exciting. So if you want to keep tabs on certain bills that are going through, then fastdemocracy.com. Anyone else? What did you learn? Drew Kate learned to sew in the quilting session. Awesome. Did anyone see that going out in the lobby? Amazing. Anything else? Yeah. We are the good. Amazing. Anything else? Yeah, absolutely. All right, one more. Emotional intelligence. Yes, definitely. Thank you. The second thing I wanted to say is just thank you to the Keene State students that are volunteering to make our video this week. So can we give them a big round of applause? All right, and last announcement before we start our conversation, the Solutions Scavenger Hunt winner. I don't think we had a lot of participants this year, but you could, oh, you did one? Okay, great. Oh, we'll do it later together. So we have a winner. Maddie Layton, come on up. So I'll say some of the solutions while she's coming up. So one of them was Linda's Closet, for example, which is a nonprofit, and they have clothes of all kinds, formal wear, business attire, active wear, whatever, for folks who need it and can't afford it, and it's just free. You just get what you need. There you go. Thank you. It's so creepy. She just reminded me that's her hat trick. She's won the game 3 years in a row. She also has a really cool Doc Martin collection. There's a whole Instagram. You should check it out. All right. So now I'm going to invite Nicole and Shaylin up to the stage, and we're going to sit down and have a really good conversation, and I'm looking forward to it. So here we go. We didn't practice this part. So the reason that we've shifted from Shaylin doing kind of the talk that you've done how many times?
Over 100, probably.
Over 100 is kind of because who was here for the opening session? Awesome. Do you remember the reading and how she talked about the ecotone, kind of the place between two spaces and the tension that happens there? And so I think Shaylin's in a little bit of the ecotone with how she's viewing the things that she's been talking about and thinking about for 25 years. And sometimes when you're in that space, being in there with other people is just better, right? And it's more effective. And so we're just going to hang out and have a great conversation. Just to tie it into the summit, though, she is the co-author of The Upswing, which was referenced in the screening that we had the night before the summit, Join or Die. And she's spent years on the road giving talks, and now she's kind of at this point where she's trying to figure out how we can just get from this point of thinking about it to actually authentically living it. in our lives. And so I'm going to kick it to Nicole to say a couple more things before we start the conversation.
Thank you. It's always a little strange to be having a conversation in front of an audience, and we've been having a conversation for several days now. But I think, there's really a need to hold on to certain aspects of expertise, and Shaylin has it, right? When you have studied something for as long as she has, there is a wealth of knowledge and so many insights you can pull from it. And I will have us start this conversation digging into that a little bit and making sure that we can share with you some of those insights. And then there's the difference, because so many of us once we become an expert in something, we're also taught, conditioned to act as though we have all of the answers to intractable social or environmental problems, economic problems. And I have also been in that position at various points in time, and more recently I've found myself telling people when I describe who I am or what I do, that I feel like I am now an uncertainty merchant, and that there is value in being uncertain together and wondering out loud. And I think if part of what we know we need to do is to connect with each other, to reweave. There's something about that, again, that might have something in there. Focus on the we and reweave our social fabric. We also have to recognize that we've all been socialized and conditioned in the kinds of behaviors, norms, concepts of identity that ask us to do otherwise. And so we have to be a little uncertain as we walk towards how we do this. And doing that in conversation is a lot better than trying to do it on your own. So with that, Shaylin, can you start this conversation in earnest by telling us what you've learned through examining all of the history that you brought up and brought to the world in the upswing that might have been in Join or Die, because I don't want to assume that everybody has that background.
Yeah, thank you both for that really kind framing and for just your generosity of spirit in helping me grapple with what to say to this really special audience, right? I mean, I think that you've spent 2 days now asking this question, how do we regenerate rural? Looking through the lens of a frayed social fabric. But one thing I've noticed, and maybe you've noticed it too, is what do we mean when we're talking about a frayed social fabric? I mean, it's been alluded to multiple times as something that we can sort of feel, right? So raise your hand if this is something that you sort of feel in your bones. But raise your hand if you could describe exactly what it is or how we could measure it. Right, okay, so that feeling is not something we should dismiss, but I do think it is helpful to say, what are we really talking about when we're talking about America's frayed social fabric? And so when researchers look at this, they really can measure it. They can measure the health of our communities. And the way that they do that is with a metric called social capital. Now, social capital is just basically the idea that relationships have value in a community for lots of different reasons, but specifically for the health of a democracy, right? And when we talk about what constitutes social capital, we're talking about a whole range of things, really. Everything from how likely people are to form families, which is one of the most basic units of a community, to whether people go to church, whether they are members of a church but don't attend, whether they vote, whether they believe that others are trustworthy. There's a whole range, whether they join bowling leagues, right? And so for those of you who saw Join or Die, this is, of course, familiar territory, but what we know is that all of those very measurable things have been in marked decline for about 70 years now. And so that's really what we know about the state of our social capital or our social fabric. But what's so interesting and what the upswing particularly adds to that conversation is it says, a frayed social fabric is not the only thing in our society that's frayed. We also have some of the deepest economic inequality that we've ever had as a nation. We also have the deepest political polarization we have ever had, with the exception of the Civil War. And we also have a culture, and this is something that we can measure, even though it seems squishy. We have a culture that is extremely self-centered. I would even venture to say narcissistic, as compared to more solidaristic or more focused on what we can do together, right? So all of these things are things that are sort of in extreme in our nation. Social isolation, political polarization, economic inequality, and cultural narcissism. But how did we get here, right? I mean, that's the question, right, that the upswing really seeks to answer. And in order to answer that, we have to really zoom out. And so I hope in this conversation, we can start by zooming way out for just a minute to get this sort of bird's eye view of what we're talking about. But for me, the zooming out has actually led me to zooming way back in. And we're gonna get there. So hang with me for just a minute longer as we get this bird's eye view. Professor Putnam is a world-class data scientist, and I am not. I am a storyteller. So for those of you who are not statisticians out there, like, you're in good company. But we're gonna talk a little bit about the data for a second. What we were able to do is to look at all of those 4 metrics, those 4 measures of society, and really look back as far as we possibly could into American history and say, what were the trend lines? Like, was there ever a time when we were not moving in this downward direction on these 4 things? And the answer is yes. That before we were in this deep downturn, we were actually in an upswing. And so when you look at, and I actually should have grabbed the clicker, I'm sorry I didn't, but we can advance the slide one more time, and I don't know if you can see this because of the lighting, but what this looks like over time is, this is a graph starting in roughly the 1880s, 1890s, which is about when we start to have reliable longitudinal data on these measures. And we're looking again at those 4 lenses of American society: politics, economics, and culture. Each of those is represented by a line of a different color. And you can see that we are not looking at 4 different trajectories here. We're looking at one trajectory, right? These are things that are deeply correlated. And so as Bob and I, sort of tried to figure out how to tell this story, we started telling it as America's I, we, I century. And there's really 3 lessons. There's a ton of lessons we could pull out of this, and we could spend a whole hour talking about those. But there's 3 that I want to highlight to kickstart this conversation. When you look at a graph like this, I think one of the most hopeful messages of knowing this story is that, can you see how we've been here once before?
Yeah.
It's easy to look around today and say, so much despair. So much despair because, it feels like this is uncharted territory. Like, things have never been this bad. We've never had this confluence of problems happening all at once, right? I think all of us have had that thought once or twice, if not more. But the reality is that we have, by hard measures, been here once before, and we got out of it once before. Because just like today, back in the 1880s and 1890s, there were all these doomsday prophecies about how democracy had failed and America had gone off the rails, and tyranny, oligarchy, and plutocracy, and all was lost. But we know that none of those doomsday prophecies were fulfilled. On the contrary, America entered this multifaceted, multi-decade upswing that lasted 70 years. So if they did it then, we can do it now. So that's lesson number 1. That's a really hopeful lesson. Lesson number 2 is not as hopeful, and this is where some of the grappling comes in. Robert Putnam initially published Bowling Alone 25 years ago in the year 2000. I was in the very first Harvard class of undergraduates to be taught this data. And so really my career has tracked along with the social capital movement because I was captivated by it. And I thought, this man has really put his finger on the pulse of what's wrong with this country. And wow, we can fix that. And I come from a tight-knit community. I know how to fix this. But the truth is that everything that we've tried, everything that we've done, all of our solutions to try to get at reweaving our social fabric have not worked. And how do we know that? Well, we just look at the graph, right? You can see where we were in the year 2000 when the Bowling Alone book was published, and we can see where we are today. An entire academic field, international academic field was spawned to study this. Millions of dollars, philanthropic dollars, have been pumped into community building initiatives. And things have only gotten worse. And I was saying to Nicole that, what would have happened if we hadn't discovered this? And if we hadn't started pumping money into it? I hesitate to even think, but it is true that nothing we've tried up till now has reversed the trend.
One of the things that was really helpful for me in our conversations recently was when you were able to really specify and categorize the kinds of things that we've been trying. So like, yes, there's all this money, and yes, there's all this research and attention and dialogue and concern, but there have also been some key strategies that seem to have not had the intended consequence. Do you want to just identify what some of those are?
Yeah, I think, let's go back to the data for a minute to try to answer that question, okay? Because what's so interesting is when you have graphs like this, you can mine lots of answers from them. And one of the questions that we have when we look at graphs like this is, well, if they did it once before, how did they do it, right? And can the data tell us anything about how the last upswing was set in motion? And one way that you can do this statistically, again, I'm not a statistician, but I'll explain it to you the way it needs to be explained to me, right? Which is that when you have a bunch of trends that start moving in the right direction at roughly the same time, statisticians can look for something called the leading variable. In layman's terms, that just means what changed first. Which of these trends started moving in the right direction first? Because if we can identify which one that is, we might have a clue as to what we should focus on if we want to drive this multifaceted correlated phenomenon forward. And what's really interesting about the story of the upswing is when you pair the data with the historical record, it is crystal clear that the thing that changed first was culture. Association and joining clubs was not far on, after that. But what really shifted first was culture. So what we know is that economic solutions didn't come first. We didn't fix our economic inequality and then suddenly we all felt like we were in this together and then other things began to shift. We didn't actually fix our political polarization first so that we could finally get things done in the public square and then we started feeling like we were in this together. We actually chose to believe, because culture is about beliefs, we chose to believe that we were in this together first. We chose to believe that. And on the heels of that belief, we started coming together and forming associations. And then we started changing the way that we did our politics and we did our economics. But what's so fascinating about that is it's hard to make a program or an initiative about changing hearts and minds. So it's easier to go to the economics, it's easier to go to the politics, it's easier to go to the join a club or start a club. And in our modern day cult of productivity, it feels really good to do those things because that's what we're conditioned to do. But what the data telling us, ironically, is that this is maybe more about being than doing. And that's really what I've been grappling with for the last several years, is what does that mean? And then what does that look like?
And where I started us was by saying that the way we show up, when we show up in our official roles, when we're here on behalf of our institution or our organization, when we write a strategic plan, when we go out and write the grant, when we do the data collection and the reporting, when we build a business, a social enterprise, we do all of those things, we are doing, right? And we are hopefully doing in a way that we feel feeds our being, that is vocation and soul craft, that has purpose, and that addresses these very challenges, right? Like, we are pulled to that. You're probably here because you're among those people. But it feels like maybe we've gotten something a little confused in the translation or the sorting and the containering, the positioning we've put it in. Sometimes we put these goals and then the same kinds of strategies into our work because we want them to be centralized. And in this economy, our work is a very central feature of our lives, right? But it's not necessarily shifting how we're being, and it might actually be working at cross purposes with the being part of this. Because if we're so busy doing the work of social weaving, rebuilding social capital, addressing some of the harms that all of those trend lines signify, right? Then do we have the time, the space, the energy, the attention to focus on the being?
Yeah, and in my more honest moments, I think I've started to ask myself, like, am I actually just outsourcing my inner work? Right? Am I actually just saying, well, because I'm in the world building community, building a social fabric, then it's okay that I'm not stepping back and asking myself the hard questions about who do I need to be in the world if I want to be a person that believes we is more important than I. And
Mark Brackett talked about that today too, when he was talking about his work with emotional intelligence, and he had that great conversation, and someone said, well, whose Uncle Marvin are you, or something like that, you know? And he was like, whoa, like, I can talk about it, but do I really have to do it?
maybe our AV guys can advance to the next slide. I can't seem to get it to go, but
Oh, it was? Okay.
oh, we went too far. We're already looking at Jane Addams, my hero. Okay, what's
Further
so
back, or good?
This is good.
Okay.
So what's so interesting is that this very insight was actually part of the cultural shift that moved us from the Gilded Age into the progressive era, which is what kickstarted that upswing. So this is a guy named Washington Gladden. He was actually an evangelical pastor. He was a Christian who was one of these cultural influencers, in terms we would use today, who started to get people to think differently. And this is what he said. He said, it is idle to imagine that changes in our governmental machinery, our politics, or our industries, our economics, will bring us peace. The trouble lies deeper. What we have got to have if we want true democracy is a different kind of men and women to whom duties are more than rights and service dearer than privilege. So he saw it before it took us 125 years and reams of data to have this core insight that he was having at the moment of this cultural shift, right? But this is tough stuff to say. The work I'm doing out there might not actually be that transformative. So if I want to do transformative work, like how do I do that?
And I think an important message as you're asking yourself that question is that even experts on a topic don't always know what to do. Experts, all of us can get to places in our work where we're really like in transition. And how many of you have birthed children? Yeah. When you're in transition, what is it like? Yeah, you think you're going to die.
There's no way out but through, but you can't go through.
Yeah. You're just, I can't, like I will die, like this, you know? And sometimes when you're in transition, it's messy, you know? And sometimes you need to hear from people that you're in that place so that you don't feel alone, so that you don't feel like I'm the only one that doesn't have it figured out. So in this evolution of your thinking, you know, you're thinking the way I've been approaching this has value in some ways, but it's not enough. Something needs to change. What experiences caused you to get to that place?
Yeah, so maybe I should just clarify, like, I'm not an academic, actually. My career was really more in the nonprofit space. I've been a social entrepreneur, I've been a volunteer coordinator, I've been the executive director of a nonprofit, right? So, like, I've been in a lot of the seats that many of you sit in right now. So I just want to, now you got to remind me of your question.
What experiences kind of brought you to this place of transition in your thinking and in your being, really?
I mean, I think, weirdly, I really do think that it's the data, right? Because it's just this puzzle that I can't quite figure out, which is if we're all working on this thing, Like our lives depend upon it. Like, why isn't it getting better? Why are we still seeing incredible amounts of deaths of despair? Why are we in a massive loneliness epidemic? Why are our teenagers committing suicide at unprecedented rates? Like, what are we getting wrong here? And I really do think coming back to that question of culture is helpful. But here's the caveat. When we start using terms like culture change, that immediately puts us back in that professional distancing situation, right? Because culture change is a thing that experts know how to do. So we can ask the experts how, if we want to change a culture, how do we change a culture, right? And there are answers for that, for sure. But I think sometimes those answers feel so far outside of ourselves. Should I go back and get a PhD in culture change? Was that what I should do? The problems seem way too urgent for that. And that was really the place that I was in. And so for me, it came to the point of getting really serious about what it means to be a different kind of woman. And that meant really examining whether I was embodying the things that I was on stages preaching that people should do more of, right? Which is be focused on we. And so that caused I actually worked with David Brooks to launch the Weave Initiative at the Aspen Institute. And during that time was doing a lot of writing about the types of weavers that you saw on the stage. But I got really worried about like what it meant to put people on this kind of a pedestal and say, these guys are doing the great work and we should all look like them. And I started to think like, maybe I shouldn't do that as much. Maybe I need to tell my own story of what it would look like to be a weaver, like right where I sit, right? And so I launched something called Project Reconnect, which was this lovely little packaged thing, like I was gonna challenge myself to be more connected, and I was gonna go do these like little challenges, like inviting people over to dinner and going and meeting my neighbors, none of which is bad, this is all great. But it was also a little bit like performative.
Branded.
It was branded. I mean, I branded it myself because I thought, well, the way I have to do this, I have to engage in an experiment that people will be interested in, and I have to show change over time, and then I can write that into a book, and I will sell the book, and it will convince people to do more of this thing. And I was like, even that, like, I don't know, whoa.
We're trying a little too hard.
We're trying a little too hard here. I mean, I don't know that it's actually this complicated, but also it's really complicated. And there's that messy middle, right? Of feeling like this has to be simpler than this. So, COVID happened, and after COVID, Project Reconnect took on a new urgency. But even that, it just, again, it felt like we were all trying to perform the importance of connection after having learned the hard way how important connection is, right? And so I don't know. I mean, I don't have a lot of answers. I do have some experiences that I can share that may point us in some interesting directions. But I think these are all live questions.
So you went through this phase where you were being really deliberate about doing the thing, moving to we in your own life, but so deliberate that you were going to track it, right? So deliberate that you were going to have different strategies you were going to try and explore. And something felt a little off as much as you were pulled to it because it was a way to embody it. That doesn't mean your unease about that doesn't mean you didn't do the things. And through some of our recent conversations in our eco gathering a couple weeks ago, you started to share some stories of what it was like when you stopped talking about it, studying it, trying to do it, and you just started reaching out. And that, too, doesn't mean you had all the answers or you knew how to do it, but it has led to at least some experiences from which you can begin to draw insight. I'm hoping maybe this is a good point to share some of those.
Yeah, so this is kind of an interesting one that happened not too long ago. I've been thinking a lot about this question of trust, because trust and social trust can be measured in different ways. So we know that trust in institutions, for example, has never been lower in this country. But there's also another form of trust, which is social trust. And that means, do I trust you? Like, do I look around and think, generally speaking, that these people around me are trustworthy, worthy of my trust? Or do I think, for the most part, people, you can't be too careful? In fact, I think in the survey questions, they actually use that phrase, like, you can't be too careful, right? And those, those measures are in the toilet as well. The social trust is really, really low in this country and falling off year by year. And so I got to thinking about this, and again, I thought, well, when you look, there isn't really like a reason that social trust should be lower. It's not like crime rates have skyrocketed, right? This really is about beliefs. And so I decided to sort of think about how I would do a radical experiment in trust building, because trust building isn't necessarily about building trust between people over there, which is how we might think of it as an institutional hat, right? Like if I'm doing trust building work, I'm bringing people who don't trust each other into a room, and then I'm trying to facilitate some trust building. Well, I thought, well, how do I build trust in myself? Because if it's a belief about whether people are trustworthy, well, how do I choose to believe that people are trustworthy? So my son's preschool during the summer months brings a bunch of teachers from all over the country to come and get training, and they usually solicit the members of the community to house these people. And I got the email, and there were 3 weeks on that list that I was going to be, out of town. Our family was going to be out of town when those 3 weeks were needed for housing. And so I thought, oh, okay, I can volunteer to do this. But then I realized that the first woman was going to arrive several days after we had left for vacation. And then another woman who didn't know that first woman was going to have to come, and then another woman after that. And I didn't really want to ask one of my neighbors to be like an Airbnb host for me. And so I got to thinking, like, what am I going to do about this? And I thought, well, maybe here's a chance to experiment with some radical trust. And so I decided to just leave the door to my house unlocked for 3 weeks. Now, I have the privilege of living in a pretty safe neighborhood, but it's not perfect. I mean, my neighbor has had bikes stolen out of her garage, and, we've got drug activity happening around the corner from our house in a couple different directions, and things are, but I thought, what if I just trusted these people? What if I believed that they were trustworthy? And I realized that this is not an experiment that I'm going to recommend that everybody go out and do, because we all have different circumstances, right? But being in rural communities as we are, like, you might understand that this could be something that we could do. But our common sense, our prevailing culture, our culture of I says, you can't be too careful. But is that really true? And so we did. We left the door unlocked. We asked our neighbor across the street to just keep an eye and to text us if anything seemed off. And, he's given us some reasons to think he's maybe not the most trustworthy character in the entire world, but we decided to trust him too. And everything worked out great. We had 3 perfect strangers come in and out of our home, sleep in our bed, watch our Netflix, and it was fantastic. And I think it was and I don't say that because, again, wow, look at me, I'm so great, I'm a trusting person. It's more like, what does that do to me and to those people? For me to extend that trust and for those people to receive that trust in a world where that never happens. And what did we learn from whether we really are worthy of trust?
When we first had that conversation, I'm going to speak in my low, sultry voice so that you can hear me. I gave the example of when I was selling something on Facebook Marketplace, and I said we couldn't coordinate a time, so I said, you know what, I'll leave it in my driveway and just, slip the money under the chair leg on the porch or something. And I was fully aware that that potentially meant that I didn't get the money. And there was a time in my life where that wouldn't have been possible, that I needed that money to buy groceries, and I couldn't have taken the risk that I didn't get that money. But I am in the place where I could do that. And that person was just falling all over themselves, well, I am a trustworthy person, and I said, it's okay. Even if you don't leave the money, it's okay. I trust you, but it's going to be okay either way. And I think that, like you said, the experience of exercising trust and the experience of receiving trust matters. It's like blazing those neuro pathways that have gotten all mixed up.
And it's really interesting to think, like, this is what countercultural action looks like. Because we are in a culture of I, make no mistake about it, right? So if I take an action that extends trust, that is a deeply countercultural action that has deep meaning and value, I think.
Are you going to tell your bee story?
Am I going to tell which story?
Your bee story?
Oh, I wasn't, but I could.
That's a good one. I like that one.
About when the woman I gave the bees
The
to.
venom?
Yeah.
Yes.
Such a strange story. We're going to talk about a time when, so I can't even say I keep bees. Nissa, who's over there, helps me keep bees, and we have bees. And I have been struggling with what's maybe some long COVID stuff, some chronic health issues, and I discovered that when I got stung by the bees, I felt a lot better and learned that that's a real thing. And then a couple of days later on a mutual aid chat, someone posted and said, well, I think this is a really weird kind of request, but I need about 20 bees for a medical treatment for these long-term health issues I have. And I'm not very good around the bees yet, I'm learning, but I decided to respond and to say, like, okay, I can do this, I can harvest the bees, right? And so I did it, and she drove over, and I had the bees in a jar, and it was very clear that, like, she was in pain and that this was going to take the pain away. And we had this moment where she was like, I can pay you, I can barter, I can, what can I do? And I was like, I'd like to give you these bees. And then she said to me, what if I need more? Like, I feel like I have to pay you because if I'm gonna need more of the bees, like, I have to then be able to put this into a transactional space. And I just said, no, I think we'll figure it out, right? Like, I think we'll figure it out, and even if, like, it doesn't come back to me, if there's someone else you're able to help, then that's great. And, like, maybe we'll learn how to tend them together. Maybe we'll learn how to, like, care for this hive together. And that, to me, was, like, a totally different way of thinking about how we could exchange, how we could be in relationship with these bees and take care of them so they could take care of us, right? So extending that we even more broadly. And recognizing that in a culture of reciprocity, it doesn't have to come back directly to me, right? It's gonna circulate around us. And I think as we're talking about the flow and the movement of trust, the flow and the movement of, yes, material resources, of the things that stand in for value like money, there are moments we can do this, like you said, and moments we can't based on our circumstances. But I think often the scarcity mindset that we have because of the culture of I, which is really a culture of hoarding the good, the resources for yourself, make more of us feel like we can't in situations when we probably can, and condition ourselves to that over and over. And I will say, having lived and existed at various places on the socioeconomic spectrum, having, like, been through those phases in my own life, poorer folks know this and are so much more generous with their time, with their spirit, are so much more collaborative. And so, like, that's another part that takes me back to the, like, oh wait, we're solutionizing a thing that we all much more intuitively understand when we have to figure out how to create abundance together. And so if we think of trust in the same way, yes, there might be a time in your life when you need that $20 to go buy groceries, and that is immediate, and of course you're gonna try to make sure you get it because you're selling the thing so you can turn it into money, so you can turn it into groceries. But there are gonna be times when you can take the risk, and what we're not calculating in our rational brains is the risk we're taking by not trusting, the harm we're doing to ourselves, and how much bigger that might be, especially when it multiplies and amplifies across all of us.
Well, and this is really the insight. I mean, is this the secret driver of the downturn? I mean, we're looking at these charts asking ourselves, why isn't everything that we're doing not working? Well, maybe it is really because there is such power in this mindset change and the cultural change that can flow from it. And we're too afraid actually to take that tiniest of step. We're out in the world taking these big steps and these brave steps, but maybe I need to be more brave within myself.
But there's times where that's gone well, like the story that you told, right? And then there's times that hasn't gone well. So do you want to share one of those times?
Yeah, and I should preface this by saying, like, I share a lot of stories about my neighbors in my neighborhood, and I've lived in a lot of different neighborhoods, so not all the stories that I tell take place in this town. And I should say that because I see some of my neighbors actually sitting in this crowd.
Small town stuff.
Could be you, could not be. So. It's not just about my kids and your kids, but in a culture of I, that's the right thing to do. To be a good parent in the culture of I is to say, these are my kids. So we're going to circle the wagons, we're going to batten down the hatches, and we're going to say to you, good luck with those big, ugly problems that you have. And instead, I chose to just say, these are our kids. And because here's the thing about neighbors. Whether you like it or not, you are a we with those neighbors. You have made a choice to share space with them, and that doesn't go away, which is why conflicts with our neighbors are so hard, because every time you drive by their house, an unresolved conflict becomes like another thorn in your soul, right? And that's true. And that situation evolved, but I will never forget the look on that mother's face when she said to me, I am so grateful to you for not just branding us as those people. I can't tell you how much that means to me. And I really hope that I tried to do what Mark was telling us that we need to do today, was to just be there in a non-judgmental, empathetic, open-hearted way. And I don't know, that experience to me has been really what I would call formative. Because it's not clear. It's not like, oh, and then we did this and we all were fine and the kids have played together 100 times since and nothing's ever happened and it's perfect. I mean, that story doesn't end that way. But something in her changed and something in me changed when we had that experience together.
I'm going to let that sit for just a second. And I'm going to ask everybody to just take a moment to reflect on when you have been in a place where you had an I versus a we kind of choice, with no judgment for yourself about which choice you made. Because we've all had so many of these, and we've all often made the I choice. Again, despite what our good works in the world are about, despite what our aspirations for who we are and who we want to be are.
And I would add to that, often the very busyness and overwhelm that often comes with being a really effective doer in the world sometimes gives us an excuse, and I'm saying this from personal experience, right, to actually make the I choice. Because we're doing so much we out in the world, like, I'm tired. I get a pass, right, on doing restorative justice with my neighbors. Like, whew, like.
As Bayo Akamalafe says, times are urgent, we must slow down. Because if we don't slow down, we can't do the we work. And if we don't slow down, we're going to default to the things we've been conditioned to do as responses. But I'd love to pick up this thread about pace and slowness, about busyness, about doing, because that is one place where I think when we step back into our more professional roles in our rural communities, that we do have an opportunity to start shifting things outside of just the interpersonal, right? And I say just the interpersonal, recognizing that it is just the interpersonal. It is the most important, right? But what are we all doing in trying to do the good work that might be actually increasing that sense of overwhelm and decreasing our capacity to grow in and as beings, right? Like, have we started to see and feel that even as we're out here trying to figure out rural transportation, and like I was moderating the land panel today, and our speakers are absolutely wonderful people doing absolutely wonderful work that keeps getting harder because we're not addressing the upstream issues. And as I heard them describe what they have to do to try to match farm seekers with land, it's like 17 different programs and sets of counseling and risk management and balancing and enterprise budgets and access to financing capital, all to just get someone to a place where they can grow food for their community, right? And so sometimes that solutionism that we're all really good at because we're going to overcome the obstacles is preventing us from being able to show up outside of our institutional roles and say, wait, everything about this is too complicated. We need to stop what we're doing and figure out how to come together differently.
And I'm curious if there's like a yes and too, right? Because how many of you get in the phase where you like haven't read a book in a while and you're like, oh, I don't want to read. Oh, that doesn't sound good right now. You know what I mean? And then you read a book and you get into the book and you're like, how has it been this long since I've read a book? I want to read more. And I think what is good about these amazing ideas and solutions that kind of move us forward is sometimes you have to do something before you feel it, or like we've got recreation therapists, in the back. Like sometimes there's a little bit of a yes and, like enough time to slow down and deeply consider, and also the need to like move and do at the same time. And there's some sort of middle ground there.
Stop the doing, because the doing that we are doing, let's see how many times I can put the word in the sentence, okay? The doing that we're doing is necessary to keep other harms at bay. It's necessary to create the good that we want to have in our lives, right? There is a whole host of reasons that we have to do, but how do we try to start shifting the balance so that we can create the time and space to embody weaving as part of, to mend ourselves and to stitch ourselves back into our little corner of the fabric, instead of imagining that it is this national social fabric with holes everywhere that somehow we're going to find a solution for, or even at our level, a regional or town-wide fabric, right? Like really maybe we have to get so close and look at who's across the street, look at who's in our kids' classroom, look at who we interact with when we go buy our groceries, and deeply humanize those interactions.
And I think it's also to look sometimes no further than our own hearts, right? I mean, how many of us are so good at doing brave work in the world, but when we're at the class picnic, can't get past our own social anxiety to have a meaningful conversation with the person next to us, right? Like, raise your hand if you're in that boat. Join me, okay? I think, and sometimes we say it's okay, right? Because again, I'm tired, or because I'm doing this other good work in the world. But I think that there's sometimes, and this really did come around for me as I kind of did my cute little project Reconnect, right? Like, is I realized like, oh, I think I sort of need to reconnect with me before I can reconnect with other people. Because that performative thing is about there being some distance between the me that's out there and the me that's here, and doing some work to reconcile that. So when we talk about doing inner work, me outsourcing my inner work, right? Like what is my own inner work around having conversations with strangers? What stops me from doing that? What do I need to heal in myself so that I can show up in a way that's open for weaving?
And maybe we have to really think about that over-under pattern of weaving, because if you stay in that space of like, I had to do all the inner work to figure out why it is I can't talk to the other moms on the side of the soccer field, real example, real in real time, and I'm going to wait until I solve it The soccer season is over.
Read another book to figure out how to get over my social anxiety.
So instead, I have to recognize that there's something holding me back. And then I have to step into the doing of having a conversation and letting it be awkward. And then I can go back and figure out, how do I feel about that? And then I can think, maybe next time I'm not going to bring my laptop with me as a crutch, right? Like, it's that back and forth. And man, does that sound like, I cannot believe I'm sitting on a stage in front of a room of people whose attention I have, and that's what we're talking about, right? Doesn't that feel both embarrassing and almost painfully unimportant? And yet this is the stuff we don't talk about. This is the stuff we don't expose. And instead, I just tell everybody about this like really important, impactful work that I'm doing. And so of course I have the laptop on my lap, right? And oh yeah, it's so great that you do what you do.
That was me at soccer practice the night before Radically Rural. I was like, I didn't speak to a single soul. I was just sitting on the blanket, just staring and like reading the business journal so I could be ready.
And that, you know what, like maybe in that moment, like this has been kind of a lot. You do kind of have a big thing going on here this week. So maybe we
Few
give you a
hundred
pass.
people coming from across the country to
Maybe that's not the same.
that's okay. And we're going to give you a pass on
But
that
2
one.
weeks ago, I did not. I had a deadline of my own making. So I'm just saying, we have to kind of nuance each of these things and not make new rules around them. So the rule is now not no laptops ever at soccer practice, no head in, but am I most of the time allowing myself to inhabit the discomfort until it turns into something more familiar? And then, as it does, am I willing to trust, to expect that I am not going to always have it go right and move through the next cycle of discomfort when there is rupture and there needs to be repair?
And all of that sounds really big, but let's just remind ourselves that we're talking about having conversations on a soccer field, right? Which both is a signal to, again, how big. Let me take you back to that bird's eye view for how big this problem is. We have to get this right because nothing less than the fate of the American experiment hangs in the balance. But I would submit to you today that the place we have to start is right here. It is the only thing we have full control over. And if the data is true, maybe it's the only thing that really matters. Maybe the place to leave you is if we can advance to Jane Addams. She up there? This is another progressive era heroine of mine. She said this: "We are under a moral obligation in choosing our experiences, since the result of those experiences must ultimately determine our understanding of life. We determine our ideals by our daily actions and decisions. Our ideals are not something that we proclaim. Our ideals are something that we embody, whether we like it or not. We are under a moral obligation to choose the experience of talking at the soccer field or not, because those experiences both express our ideals and are also formative of them. And I hope that this has just given you something to think about. I hope it doesn't feel like another burden. And if it does, that's okay. I'm there with you too. It feels like yet another aspect of this that I have to explore in a difficult way. It's okay to feel that. But I also think there's something liberating about it, because it's right here. It isn't a system that has to change on my watch. It's a heart that has to change, and that heart is mine. And when that heart changes, maybe another one will change with me, and another one after that. And that is kind of how culture change happens at the end of the day.
Can y'all stay with me? Okay. Is that on there? So the last few things I want to say, and thank you for staying with me. So I want to end in community because I don't want to be here alone. And I just want to say that Radically Rural, we've always been known for, you talked about the trend that changes first, and you called that what?
The leading variable.
The leading variable. We talk about positive deviance, right? So you have many communities that have, trouble with their healthcare systems and getting that. Like, who has done it well? How can we learn from them? The positive deviance. So Radically Rural, we focus on solutions. We focus on good ideas and positive forward momentum. But I think for me, that doesn't happen without sitting in the unknown sometimes and the messy middle. Because if we just skim on the surface and we never get to that point, we're never really going to make deep, meaningful, long-lasting change. And what I love about this experience is, like, I don't know, it feels like this year for the first time for me that Radically Rural as this national and international network feels like a small town to me. And I want to co-create future programming with all of you. So if there's a messy middle that you need to sit in, or if there's something that you see percolating that you want to bring to the surface, like, please reach out to us, because this is for you. Like, we belong to each other, and we don't need to own or claim credit for anything. We need to freely shape and share together. So that's how I'll end it for the summit, and I hope to see some of you at the after party, and safe travels, everyone. Thank you for being here.